You're listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a podcast offered in partnership with Missio Alliance. Each episode, we discuss internal and relational pressures, how they block effective leadership, and how we can move through them to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
Folks, welcome back to part 2 of the 8 concepts of Bowen theory. You can listen to this episode if you haven't already listened to part 1, and this episode will make sense even if you didn't hear part 1. But I will just say in part 1, we did give just a little bit of context to these 8 concepts, so that might help you. But either way, both episodes are kind of a pair to help you understand a little bit about systems theory, and ideally, if we do our job right today, Brendan, helping people put some of these into practice.
Right. So first concept, we're just going to go right into it, is the first one we talk about today is sibling position.
Yeah.
Which I honestly think a lot of people are innately already familiar with in some sense.
I agree. Yeah. This was come up with in 1950s, and this was new then. But
right. I think a lot of people know this one now. Yeah. So basically, it's the idea that your family order that you're born into has an impact on the way that you act, your characteristics, the things that you do with other people, your relationships, and how you interact with people from different birth orders. Common example is oldest on some level tends to be leaders, youngest tends to be a follower. How do those two interact with each other in relationships and work relationships? So
yeah, so let me read a little quick definition. Sibling position. This is one of the what are we up to here? The 5th concept of Bowen theory. Mm-hmm. A classic look at how birth order affects your outlet and behavior, not just in family and marriage, but in workplace, etc. Typically, if you have 5 or more years between siblings, you act like an only child. So if somebody's 5 years older than you or 5 years younger than you, you tend to show up more like an only child than a sibling. So I'll give an example first, and if anything comes to mind for you, Brendan.
Yeah.
I'm a youngest. My sister's 3.5 years older than me. And what's interesting is I'm a pretty sensitive guy. I grew up as a pretty sensitive kid. In my teenage years and then into my early 20s. I overcompensated with a lot of confidence. That's when I really started to be affirmed for leadership gifts. And it wasn't, I was a late bloomer. I didn't go to college till I was 20. And it wasn't until I was in college, my sophomore year, I was 21 or 22, where people called out in me my playfulness and my creativity. And I didn't realize that as a youngest, I roll into a room ready to have fun rather than ready to be responsible. But because in my teenage years, I was a leader in our youth group and all of that, I always felt responsible. Plus I was insecure, and I covered my insecurity through over responsibility.
Wow.
And so college for me was really fun because I kind of got to act like the kid that I hadn't acted like in years. And then in chaplaincy, I went straight from college to hospital chaplaincy. And I started as a chaplain, never, I believe, inappropriately, but to figure out how do I bring playfulness and creativity into this very earnest, painful environment. And so, as you might imagine, I was smart enough to know when not to do it. But I did 6 months of pediatrics, and kids like to play.
Right.
And so I had like a rubber chicken that I'd show up with. And I remember sticking it like IV. Kids had these IV, even if they're getting like chemotherapy or something really serious. And I'd let them use my rubber chicken for an hour and come back and get it. Just goofy things that I would not have done if I wasn't aware how I'm wired as a youngest.
Right.
And so the way I've used sibling position in my own life is to be aware of my part to play in an organization. So I'm sure you've even noticed, it's very intentional. It's pretty obvious too, how often I'll sabotage a staff meeting.
Yes, you will.
To generate laughter. And I'm sure there's times where it's not needed.
Right.
But there's times where I'm feeling this need. Oh, we just need a little breather.
Right.
And it doesn't really contribute to the agenda.
Right.
Yeah, that's the youngest thing.
So I'm the oldest out of 4 siblings. My brother's the closest to me. I think he's only 2 years younger than I am. So I tend towards, I think, just doing things and just going and going after them, just doing it myself, and I think when I realized that I was a leader was when I first, I think when I went to college, a second round, but like little things like that would show up when I was younger. So I was probably, I want to say 5 or 6 years old. We lived in an apartment complex in the Midwest. And I had the idea to make a quick buck. And one of the ways that I decided to make a quick buck was I had a window scraping business in this apartment complex. So I would go around and hand out flyers to people before, and hand them on the door that I would scrape your windows for $1 in the morning before you left for work. And I generated some business income from that. People really enjoyed that I think they were helping just a kid out, but that was my first experience, I think, with just developing something on my own, leading it, chasing it. I think noticing that I had the ability to get people to rally around me was something else that I didn't really flesh out until I was in college the second time. That showed up realizing I made a huge mistake with grabbing a bunch of students. We had this, let me back up. So this is a very sensitive subject, so I'll try to not talk too in detail about what happened. But there was a situation at my college that I was going to where somebody was involved with an inappropriate relationship with a fellow student on campus at a Christian college. And I wasn't happy with how things were being handled. And so I took it upon myself to get everybody in a room and get them super excited, grab your pitchforks and your fire sticks and let's go after them.
Right.
Had a whole school-wide petition that got signed. And finally, one of the lead pastors in the area who actually was pretty involved with the school actually called me and said, "Hey, you need to trust the leadership process. You're a leader and you need to be careful because when you do these things like this, you can create total separation, dissension, all these bad things." And so for me, one of the things that I've learned is, well, it's good that I can walk into situations and get people to rally underneath a cause, but I also have to stop being so serious all the time and have a little bit more of a playful attitude, which is difficult for me.
Yeah.
So that's how I've noticed my sibling role as the oldest has really shown up in my life, is just always having a desire, I think, to lead without trying to be, I'm trying to think of the word, because it sounds like I'm a jerk, but I'm not trying to lead on to get power. It's more of a,
as the youngest, it sounds like you're just very responsible. Right. That's what I'm hearing in that story. You felt responsible to do the right thing. Right. I think that is some of these ideas are cliche, but there's a reason they're cliche. That is a fairly accurate way of being an oldest. Right. Yeah. So that's how it showed up my life. My wife is a youngest, I think. So it's been an interesting relationship with the two of us. Right. Well, she's a twin and a youngest. Yes. Which is even weirder in some sense. And with a twin, it's funny. It would have been neat to have Kelsey on the show to share what that's like, because there is a fusion between twins. Right. That makes things extra complicated for sure. Right. So. Yeah, they're very close. Right. How far apart are they in miles? Like the minutes of how long? Yeah. How far apart do they live from each other? Oh, she's only 45 minutes from us now. Yeah. Yeah. So they're pretty close still. Yeah. So that's classic with most twins. I mean, man, you think about your earliest formation in the womb. Right. I just saw a birth video. It was the cutest thing. 2 twins born. They lay the babies on mom's chest, and one twin reaches out and grabs the other one's hand. It's the first thing the twin did out of the womb. Wow, that's crazy. Like, okay, that's crazy. Yeah, that's tied in. Yeah, I think understanding that, I think it helps me understand that relationship better too. Because as an oldest, I always distanced myself, I think, from my siblings in a way, because I felt like I had to be responsible and grown up. That's right. And you were kind of responsible for their well-being. Right. Yeah. Whether I wanted to or not. That's right. Or whether they wanted you to or not. Right. Yeah. So it's interesting how all that stuff just plays an impact on every aspect of your life too. It's nuts. Yeah. And that's why you study sibling position, is to really get clarity on how you show up in the workplace. Right. And so I'll just close with this and then we should move on to the next one. Every trait in family systems theory, and really beyond systems theory, every trait has an asset and a liability to it. So my playfulness is both really helpful and annoying. Right. And you never quite know when. Your responsibility is the same. Right. And that's what's helpful, is when you really get clear on what you do and how you offer it, you can start to learn to mitigate and get really refined to make it more of a gift than a curse for people. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Number 6, triangles. Yeah, triangles are interesting. They are in many ways. I think I'm going to be ironic when I say this. Systems theory is kind of an inside joke, but they are like the bedrock of systems theory.
They're in everything. They're almost in all of these concepts, aren't they?
They are. Yeah. And there's triangles and then there's triangulation. I think the biggest misunderstanding when people start studying systems theory, Bowen teaches that triangles are the most stable relationship. It's more stable. A 3-person relationship is more stable than 2. When people read that, they think, oh, that must mean triangles are a good thing. They can be a good thing. But what Bowen is saying is that when tension goes between 2 people, the anxiety between the 2 people causes instability. So they bring in a 3rd person to help stabilize and share the load of the anxiety. And that's triangulation. And triangulation is always a bad thing. So people get confused. I've run into this before when I'll teach triangulation and people will come back and say, wait a minute, Bowen says it's a good thing. And I'll have to say, no, Bowen says it's the most stable relationship. That's why we do it so much, because we're not good at managing our anxiety with one other person.
Right.
So
what about counselors and a husband and wife relationship?
When a husband and wife are going to a therapist, therapists are actually trained to make sure they are staying out of being co-opted. I'm not a therapist, but I've done a lot of pastoral counseling, and it's I'll just say, Brennan, it's genuinely scary when a couple come in and one of them successfully co-opts you as a weapon against the other.
Wow.
It's awful. And so a trained therapist is actually skilled at staying nimble and both advocating for each individual without co-opting and joining their team. And then, like a non-trained therapist or a therapist who is not skilled could easily get triangled in.
Right.
So what that could look like is if a therapist is seeing a couple and then let's say the husband calls the therapist during the week and says, hey, I really need therapy on my own. Could you not tell my wife? That's triangulation. Even though the therapist hasn't done anything, the therapist is being triangled in. I found as a pastor, you can get triangled in without even realizing it, because pastors have a confidential relationship with people. They tell you things in confidence that you're really even legally, let alone ethically, bound to not spread. But sometimes in doing that, just by sharing something with you, they're actually triangling you against another person.
Right.
And so sometimes you have to be careful. And I've done this before with people where I'll say, that's not a secret I can keep because it affects the well-being of another person.
Right.
So you have to tell them you told me, and then I'm going to be telling them.
One famous warning sign, I think, of somebody putting into a secret triangle is when they say, hey, I've got a secret to tell you. Can you keep a secret?
Yeah.
And now I'm like, no, I can't. If it's something I don't need to know, you shouldn't be telling me.
Yeah. Or it's like, well, it depends on the secret.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I shared an example at one point when we were talking about triangles where I had a friend of mine come to me with another friend's secret, tell me the secret and say, well, now you have to keep this secret. And I'm sitting in between a rock and a hard place where if I don't say something to this friend, they're going to be like, well, why didn't you say anything? Or if they find out that I knew and I didn't say anything, they're going to be like, well, why?
You didn't care?
You didn't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. They can be pretty damaging.
Yeah. Yeah. So really, generally speaking, the best path out of a triangle is informing everybody that you're going to inform everybody.
Right. Just so you know, I'm going to tell them that you told me. So
I remember a pastor friend of mine. He's like, hey, if you'd pray for me, I have to go to the guy's house and tell his wife he's having an affair.
Oh my gosh.
And he's like, the guy told me, I told him it's not a secret I'm willing to keep. He has 2 days to tell his wife. He said he would. I'm going to the house. I don't think he has. And sure enough, this poor pastor goes to the house, hasn't told the wife.
Wow.
And he's like, tell her. Oh, what? What are you on? Do you want cooking? The guy's acting like he's just a nice visitor.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So generally speaking, yeah. The other way to notice a triangle, like in a family, is if one parent says to the child, well, you know how your mother is. That's triangulation.
Right.
Yeah. Anytime you are trying to gang up against a third person. And then where things get complicated is Bowen says, because triangles are the most stable relationship, we then form a series of interlocking triangles. And that then becomes how anxiety spreads through an organization.
Right.
So you get mobs of a bunch of people in triangles all coming at you. It can be really something.
Right. A lot of times too, they can be a way for people to exact control too.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes, a well-meaning person will triangulate because they simply don't have the emotional maturity to handle someone directly.
Yep.
And it's usually, I used to get really frustrated with those people. I think I've come to understand now that it has more to do that they just feel powerless. And so their way of feeling like they have the power to manage their life is to co-opt a mob. But holy smokes, as somebody who's had mobs co-opted against me a number of times, it's so painful. And what tends to happen is they just don't know how to come to you and say, here's the problem I have. And so most famously what they'll do is they'll vent to a third party. The third party doesn't quite know what to do or say, so they just smile and nod. And then the person who's passionate about the issue takes their smiling and nodding as agreement. And then they okay, now you're on my team. And then they come to the leader and say, me and all these people all agree about this.
Right.
Even though most of those people were just like either catching their anxiety or just saying, I guess I'll just go along,
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you notice, do you have to have somebody from an outside source tell you that you're in a triangle, or how do you notice that you're in one with somebody?
I think anytime somebody is asking you to keep a secret that affects the well-being of another person and affects your relationship with that person, you're at risk of being triangled. Secondly, you could watch the Gilmore Girls, or actually any Disney preteen drama. I think I put it in the book, but I was writing my book at the dining room table, a room over from when my daughter at the time's a preteen, and she's watching some Disney drama. And the very things I'm writing about in the book not to do, they're doing on the show.
Oh, man.
And I remember it was like a light bulb. I'm like, no wonder they call it a drama. And no wonder Kaylee can't wait for the next episode, because they raise the anxiety at the end of the show and leave things unresolved.
They're very entertaining. They're fun to watch.
Right.
Kelsey and I just watched 10 Things I Hate About You a couple nights ago.
Yep, that's
a
probably a good example there. Almost all reality television, the producers are intentionally causing triangulated relationships to generate conflict for good television.
Oh, man.
So you can get practice by watching TV.
Everybody Loves Raymond. Great example. Marie the mom, Raymond and his wife.
Yep. There's a triangle there. Yep. Yeah. Pretty much any drama and any reality show is going to have triangulated relationships in it. In your own life, yeah, if somebody comes to you and your well-being or their well-being or with each other is affected, and then you can just be careful about secret keeping, about talking about someone in a way that you would not talk about them if they were in the room.
Right.
So gossip is always a triangle. So if you're a church leader listening to this, you're well acquainted with triangles just by nature of leading a church.
Hi, I'm Doug.
And I'm JR.
On Monday mornings, many pastors wake up feeling depleted, defeated, and overwhelmed. We know this because we're pastors and we felt it.
Which is why we created a podcast called The Monday Morning Pastor.
It's a weekly podcast to encourage, equip, challenge, and resource pastors and kingdom leaders each Monday morning.
We want to tell and hear stories of hope and encouragement in the midst of this unique place in culture where the negative ministry stories seem to get all the airtime.
Our hope is that these stories resonate with and remind pastors why we stay in the game. It's a podcast that gives pastors hope and a safe place to be people who need to receive the good news on the day where we feel the most vulnerable.
So we invite you to join us and listen to the Monday Morning Pastor podcast, where pastors can be people. You can find us on kairospartnerships.org, Missio Alliance, or anywhere podcasts are available.
All right. Number 7, emotional cutoff.
Yeah. So you covered this, I think, really well in the last episode. So do you want to define it, or I can define it?
Yeah. So I think in my own personal family genogram life, emotional cutoff is anytime somebody doesn't want to have to deal with the problem anymore, or they think that they're dealing with the problem by cutting off all contact with a person in their life who they think is either the problem or getting rid of the problem. So,
yeah. So it's also, emotional cutoff is also a severe way of dealing with your anxiety with another person. I'm just, as we speak, scrolling to try to find where it is on my little Twitter feed, which oddly I now cannot find. So I have to punt on that.
So I can read it off.
Go ahead.
Let's do that. People sometimes manage their unresolved emotional issues with parents, siblings, or other family members by reducing or totally cutting off emotional contact with them. This resolves nothing and risks making new relationships too important. Yeah. So it's, I think there's plenty of families out there, and probably friendships too, where somebody is either too much for you to be around anymore. They're too much drama. They bring too much to the table, or maybe they've hurt you in some way. And every time you try to talk about it, they don't want to talk about it. And so you think probably the healthiest thing to do is to cut them off.
Right.
Which actually, I've got a question about this. Is there any point in a relationship?
The answer is yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
That's because Yeah.
There are some relationships that you have to cut off for your own safety. So, we don't cover on this podcast and in our work extreme trauma and abuse.
Right.
Even though what we do can help people in trauma and abuse, I believe they do need tools beyond what we can help with.
Right.
But sometimes cutoff is necessary in domestic violence. In ongoing addictions, sometimes cutoff is required.
Right.
And then abuse. So, the classic go-to book on this would be really anything written by Henry Cloud, but Boundaries is his go-to book. But I'll say this. What tends to happen with cutoff, particularly if you are avoidant of conflict, just by nature, you stuff and you don't know how to express. And so what happens is you take it, and then you boil over and explode, and then you cut off. What systems theory helps us with, particularly through differentiation, is give you, if you'd almost treat the relationship more like a bungee cord between you and the other person rather than a pair of scissors.
Right.
I think if you're passive aggressive, for example, if you're a conflict avoider, somebody does something and it hurts you and you don't know how to tell them and resolve it, and you end up stuffing, and then, or maybe you're fused or codependent with them, and then it's some kind of a last straw syndrome.
Right.
And
that's it.
You
last
cut them off. You're just like, enough. And you don't recognize that that's your emotional, you can grow emotionally maturely in that way and handle more ambiguity in the relationship. I don't feel like I'm explaining it well, but when you learn about cutoff and you learn about differentiation, it actually gives you the tools to manage conflict before you get to the cutoff.
Right.
Having said that, yes, like let's use a domestic violence relationship. Okay, let's use an addiction. Years ago, it was in Nevada. I did a lot of crisis intervention, and I remember a guy coming to me, and his wife was an alcoholic, and he had begged her to stop. The police had been involved. There'd been abuse toward him from her, unusual case. And one day he came in and he asked, is divorce a sin? We talked about it. Why are you asking? And he said to me, look, I don't want to leave her. We've been at it 25 years, and my patterns of behavior are part of why she keeps drinking. And her only chance of getting well is if I leave.
Wow.
I'd never heard it put that way before. I'm not condoning divorce. I'm not saying, but I think he was actually onto something. He was trying to say, I have tried for years to change the way I relate to her, and I keep falling back into the old codependency patterns. I'm leaving, and he said to me, I'm giving her everything. I'm leaving with nothing. I'm giving her every chance of success, but she's going to drink herself to death if I don't leave. I said, it was really wild. So that would be an example of he felt he had to cut her off for his good, but he also believed, and I believe him, I don't believe he was using an excuse. He had to cut her off for, I believe, her sake too. That's pretty extreme, but there's an example.
Right. But if you're not in any of those extreme examples, it's probably not a good idea to do it.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done, because I think a lot of families and people in families think that their situations are very unique. But then when you start to talk with other people, like, it's not. Like, there's so many families that struggle with the same thing.
Yeah.
And honestly, it might seem like it's the right solution at the time, but I think you're using this bungee example of like, if you let the tension stretch and stretch and stretch, eventually a bungee cord's going to snap back and you have to stick it out.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah. And I think for church leaders, what I've found often happens with a church leader that gets criticized again and again by the same people is their temptation to cut those people off is so high.
Right.
And I get it. It's out of self-protection. The people are piling on. But your ability to try to stay connected to people who are against you, obviously, boy, Brendan, even as we're talking about it, I'm just thinking, man, we can't cover all the bases here. Obviously, only our listeners and their loved ones know when they need help, when they can't take one more hit. You know what? I'm just feeling that, like, as we give this advice, there could be someone at the end of their rope saying, oh, they said we should stick it out.
Right.
I don't know about that, but I have noticed that in leadership, sometimes the response to criticism or difficult people is to demonize them.
Right.
And what I've learned in my own life, and it's pretty humbling, is when I have an anger fantasy about that person, in my head, they're wrong, I'm right. That's evidence that I'm standing on self-righteousness, not the gospel.
Right.
But in the gospel, Jesus died for those people. They're fully human people. And so, yes, somehow you do have to protect yourself, but you don't have to cast them out of your community. I'll just boldly say, I know we have Discovery listeners listen to this show, and because I'm not going to name names, we have people at Discovery that don't think two hoots about me, but are active, thriving members of Discovery.
Right.
That's great with me. Mm-hmm. Like if they're finding community, finding the gospel, they and I don't need to like me, for example.
Right.
And that took some work. I think old me would have wanted to cut them off.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think in the book from Roberta,
Gilbert. Dr. Roberta Gilbert.
Yeah, sorry about that. She actually says that America is a society of emotional cutoff.
Yes, she's the first one to really name it that way.
And I think it actually ties into our eighth concept very closely, is the societal emotional process.
Societal emotional regression.
There you go.
Yep.
How all of this stuff, all of your family things, there's this system that governs our society that we all fall into as a whole. And like, for example, here in America, that's where we live. So this is the process that's going to happen. Dr. Roberta is saying that about emotional cutoff being an American thing. I think we can even see that happening now.
Good. Yeah.
In our American political climate.
Politically. It's like the most obvious sign is politically, but even in the church, the Southern Baptist Church right now is under like almost a civil war.
Right.
Yes. The societal emotional regression. Do you want to read the definition there?
Yeah, sure. This concept describes how the emotional system governs behavior on a societal level, similar to that within a family, which promotes both progressive and regressive periods in a society.
Right. Here's what I put on my happy little tweet. Societal emotional regression. Society grows more anxious like a family does. On a macro level, societies increase anxiety when overpopulated, during scarcity of resources, during epidemics, and during economic forces out of control.
Yep.
When that happens, societies regress into anxiety and high reactivity.
Right.
So,
oh man, there's a really good thing too. Can I share this?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
So this is from the 8 Concepts of Bowen Theory by Dr. Roberta Gilbert. It's pretty dry.
We'll put a link in the show notes. Yeah, it is a little dry. I hope Dr. Gilbert's not listening, but it's a dry book.
So this one is, it's about this whole process, and this is what she says. In 1940, the teachers in California were polled to find out what they considered the most troublesome problems they faced. The results were talking, chewing gum, making noise, running in the halls, getting out of line, wearing improper clothing, and not putting paper in the wastebasket. Again, in 1990, 50 years later, they were polled. This time, the answers were quite different. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, pregnancy, suicide, rape, robbery, and assault. In 50 years, our society had changed a great deal if the schools were any indication. Consider also that between 1963 and 93, the crime rate went up 360%, youth crime went up 200, teen pregnancy up 600, and teen suicide up 300%. So in 1991, less than 60% of children were living with their biological married parents. So she starts to list these reasons of possibility why they happen.
Right.
But it's funny how different periods of our history in just different periods of countries' histories, like there's an entire societal understanding either of anxiety or calmness.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I would say I do not know American history in depth as an Australian, but it feels to me since I've lived in the United States since 1992, we are at an all-time anxiety limit.
Oh my gosh.
Today. Yeah. So systems theory, we mentioned it briefly in the first episode. The big idea is rather than just noticing problems inside us, notice problems between us and pay attention to how somebody else's anxiety infects yours,
right? How
yours infects other people. And you can also pay attention, this is the most fun, you can pay attention to how anxiety spreads in any group.
Right.
A couple little party tricks people can do if they want. Next time you're in a staff meeting, if you have a small staff, it doesn't have to be all the staff, even if it's like if you have a department, get everybody except one person ahead of time to look at one person and not blink.
Right.
And then you'll watch that one person just get suddenly anxious. That's like a prank, just a simple prank. Another thing, I had a friend of mine, he also went through chaplaincy. He came out the other side and he said, what I just enjoy is walking into a room, listening for a while, and then I simply say, are you going to let him get away with that? And it's just a giant pot stir. And then he just likes to watch what happens. So that's cruel, but you can start to pay attention to the way anxiety operates in a group, because it's not, family systems theory isn't interested in just my anxiety and your anxiety. It's interested in a whole group. So it started on the therapy couch with families. Murray Bowen used to bring into the psych ward, not just mom and dad, but brothers and sisters, grandparents, cousins. Sometimes he'd have 30, 40 people in the clinic trying to work on. I think that's a bit of an overreaction, but that's the point. Ed Friedman came along in the 1980s, and he took family systems theory off the therapy couch and put it in the congregation.
Right.
And he said, hey, I think a congregation acts like a family. And his seminal book on that is Generation to Generation, really for clergy. And then Friedman got famous with that. He started getting brought into corporate. And by the time he died, he was actually working with Colin Powell and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the military. And I don't know if it was Powell who said this to Friedman, but it was one of the military generals said, the military acts like a family. So the big idea with societal regression is any group of people takes on family dynamics, catches each other's anxiety. Here we are in 2020, election year.
Well, didn't Bowen add this theory later in his life?
Yeah, he did develop all these theories. It's a great question. I think he had them developed by the early 1970s, but they didn't all show up in 1954 for sure.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because you can clearly watch this play, like as a family, play out in American society today.
Yeah.
It's very, granted, it's a little bit more heated, I think.
Well, we're so reactive to each other right now.
Yeah, it's nuts.
So if Bowen were alive today or Friedman were alive today, they would simply be nodding and saying, I told you this, like they predicted this very predicament we're in right now.
Really?
And so what's required is Friedman's probably most famous work. It's called A Failure of Nerve.
Right.
And Friedman says what we need are courageous leaders who can be a non-anxious presence.
Right.
Which we've now, I even wrote about non-anxious presence, but now that my book is out, I've been teaching it, I've changed it to calm presence. Because I think non-anxious presence gives the false impression that you're not anxious.
Right.
But what's actually true is you're managing your anxiety.
Right.
So I call it now calm presence. What I think our society needs is hundreds of thousands of leaders who can be calmly present in an anxious culture.
Right.
And if we don't get that, we will not calm down. And we do not have a leader in the White House who is a calm presence. And we do not have very many candidates on the other side who are a calm presence right now.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, if any subject today, I think in today's episode is we're probably going to dive into more. I think that this one's probably something that I think a lot of people, like, I think we just need to talk about. Like, there was a book I read for a class a couple of years back called Can't We All Disagree More Constructively?
Yeah, right.
It's very short. I think it's only like 100 pages or something like that. But it's funny because it talked, and I never knew this because I'm younger. Like the way that I've grown up and the society I've grown up in has been very high anxiety. Everything, the world's going to end. It's all terrible.
Right.
But he talked about how at one point in time, if you want to call congressmen from both sides of the aisle families, they would all live in Washington.
Right.
And they all interacted with each other, and they all
Lots of social time together.
So they were like a connected family. And now you've got these people that are senators, congressmen, whatever. They're living back in their home states with their constituents, and they barely get any action time with the people from the opposite side of the aisle. And so then that within itself is almost a cutoff relationship.
That's right.
Where you don't have any contact with this person anymore. And the moment that you do have contact, it's a very volatile contact. And so then we've created this, I can't remember who coined this term, but I think I heard it on a radio podcast, was identity politics. Is that we have changed the family systems theory sense into saying, I identify as this, you identify as that.
Yeah, my core being is Republican or Democrat.
Right. And we don't sit down and try to work through that cutoff. Because I think right now the emotional cutoff is where our country's at. Yeah. Is that we're very cut off from one another. And I think to bridge that gap, we have to start sitting down with each other and just seeing them as a human being. Like, it might just, Bob from across the street who might be a really left-wing liberal. You should invite him over to your barbecue. Like,
yeah, there's a couple of, I'm thinking social media. So cancel culture is an example of cutoff. Okay, boomer. Right. That's a cutoff statement.
Right. Well, I'll admit I've said that a couple of times. Yeah. So.
Yeah. But even whatever generated okay, boomer was some boomers trying to, speak down. But it's still, I had a boomer recently tell me how hurt they were by that. It was interesting because of all that they've contributed to society, this person, and all that they've done, and just to be flicked away with a cynical phrase. Yeah. The other thing I think we should say about emotional cutoff, because we're speaking in doom tendency, is what's fascinating. Maybe this should be our third episode on this one day. Where's the gospel in family systems theory?
Right.
Because to the best of our knowledge, Bowen was not a believer. His ninth concept did have something to do with a divine presence. He was starting to kick around the idea of a divine presence when he died. But what I'm fascinated with is when you go from societal emotional regression and you go back down to local community, you see so much gospel, so much good work.
Right.
I just drove back this morning. We live half an hour north of Denver. And I got with a friend of mine who lives in Colorado Springs. We both drove about an hour to meet early in the morning for breakfast. And we were just sharing with each other what our churches are doing for the poor and what we're doing to serve our cities. And he was saying, he's like, we are the first church, and we're not the only church in the Springs, but we're the first church that social workers call, and that's our church as well.
Right.
And you start to realize, man, the gospel really is creating local micro communities of calm presence outside the media, outside the political platform. And I'm sure it must also be true. I don't have any insight into politics. It must also be true that the gospel's alive and well in the political, in Washington, D.C.
Right.
But it's not being watched on CNN and Fox.
Right.
And then, maybe this would be a fascinating episode, but to talk, what vested interest does the media, regardless of the media's outlet's political affiliation, it has a vested interest in keeping us at odds with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so bizarre. Yeah, I think you've said before, I think, and I don't know if it was a sermon or just a conversation, where I think one of the most beautiful aspects of the good news of Jesus is that when that at the time period, people were coming to church, you'd have the head of the household, the wife, the kid, and then the servant or the slave. And then when they came to church on Sunday morning, and I mean, probably not Sunday, but when they came to church together, they were all on the same grounds. They were all equal across the board. And I think, man, that today, if we could get that and the rest of society today, that we're all on the same playing field, that we all, when we work together, so much better things can happen with the power of Christ like that. That's radical.
It's amazing. Yeah. Whatever boundary keeps you separated outside the church is demolished inside the church.
Right. And it should be.
Yeah. I think that was Paul's vision for the church. I also personally think that's why the early church exploded in growth. It's because somebody like a household servant or a slave who's a nobody outside the church becomes a son of God or a daughter of God inside the church.
Right. Serving the head of the household community, or the head of the household serving them communion.
Yeah, it's an imaginative idea, but I think I've used it in a sermon. The idea that when a family in, say, Corinth wanted to attend church, the household servant had to get up earlier to get their clothes ready to serve their meal. Household servant then eats last.
Right.
They walk to church together, and then inside the church, it's the head of the household who's serving communion to the servant who's a, son of the king. I think that's pretty remarkable.
Right.
Yeah.
That's pretty fun stuff.
All right, folks. So that's the 8 concepts of Bowen theory. And just like we did last episode, you can listen last episode to get some additional resources, not just from us, but from other groups that we know that do really good work. And thanks for tuning in.
For more resources, visit stevecusswords.com or missioalliance.org.